We're ready to go. You are what you wear. That's the topic, the title of today. And there's so much to say on this. When I originally intended to speak about it because it related to the parsha, and the more I looked into it, the more I realized that there's so much depth, just even in Torah narrative, how much clothing plays a role in so many stories and so much of Torah, that in each one of those stories has depth and layers of what the clothing represent and mean. And as we'll see, life expresses this as well, and every culture has the clothing that it wears, and different people choose different fashions, and that can not only say a lot about us, but it can impact our lives as well. And so what we're going to do tonight is look at a bit of what Torah says about clothing and what we can learn from the instances of clothing playing a role in Torah, and how it can impact our own clothing. And clothing can mean as literal as the clothes we wear, but also the environment which we find ourselves in, because that's the extension of clothing. It's the things we surround ourselves with. So let's start from the very beginning. In the very first story we have in the Torah, in the Bible, Adam and Eve, they're in the garden, and the snake, the conniving snake, convinces them to eat from the tree. And as soon as they do that, God catches them in the act, and suddenly it says they became embarrassed of their nakedness, ashamed. And they scurried to cover themselves with fig leaves, and then God made them clothing. Right? That's really the first source we have here from chapter 3 of Genesis. So right after they ate from the tree, then the eyes of both of them were opened. They perceived that they were naked, and they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. So God said, I heard the sound of you in the garden. Sorry, Adam said, I heard the sound of you in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. So God asked him, who told you that you were naked? Did you eat from the tree which I had forbidden you to eat? So God was sort of implicating Adam based on his own testimony. You suddenly told me you're naked. You must have eaten from the tree, or else you would not have noticed your nakedness. And then God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. So there's this fascinating insight here that it seems ideally we shouldn't need clothes. In an ideal world, in the Garden of Eden, clothing was unnecessary. Only after the sin, suddenly there was a certain shame that Adam and Eve wanted to hide with clothing. And so the simplest explanation is that essentially our bodies is who we are. Why should we want to hide it? Only once it begins to be complex emotions inside, once it became evil or desire, lust became part of their personas through the sin, then suddenly there's shame in our bodies. And then suddenly we feel tension in nakedness. And to hide that shame, to conceal ourselves, they created clothes for themselves, and God gave them a more substantial pair of clothes. But there's something deeper here as well, I think. And this episode, and especially the clothing that God gave them, ends up playing a very big role throughout the continuation of history. So we have stories such as Esau went out hunting, and Yaakov wore his clothes when he went into his father to get the blessings. And the Midrash says, which clothes did Yaakov put on? He put on these clothes that God had given Adam. And that's why Isaac, when Yaakov walked into the room, he said, I smell the scent of Gan Eden. Because he smelled those clothing which still had that scent from Adam. We have the coat that Yaakov gave his son Joseph that caused a tension between the brothers and Joseph. The Midrash says, what was that special coat? That was the same coat passed on to the next generation. Adam's coat is what Yaakov handed to Joseph. And so this coat wasn't just God needed to give Adam a pair of clothing because he felt his nakedness. There's something that was going on there in the shame that Adam felt that came as a result of sin. That God handed him the clothing, handed him something which wasn't just to cover his body, but something special about his clothes that preserved it throughout the rest of the stories. And finally, we come to this week's parasha, this week's portion, where these clothing, the pair of clothes God gave Adam, crops up again. And this time we learn in source number 2, Exodus 28. And this is the beginning of the portion this week. And God tells Moshe, make holy garments for your brother Aaron, for dignity and adornment. And so, last week we read about the building of the Mishkan, the portable temple in the desert, and now the continuation of that is the priests who are going to serve in the temple. And part of that discussion is the unique uniform which they wore. The details go on to be explained that the average priest wore. There were 4 articles of clothing, and the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, were 8 pieces of clothing. And they had to wear it at all times during the service of the temple. And these clothing lasted all the way through the first temple and the second temple, the uniform that the priest would wear the entire time during the service. The Midrash says, once again, this clothing which Moses made for Aaron, for the high priest, was the clothing that Adam received from God. So there's this continuation of the story, whereas this clothing is passed down from generation to generation, always appearing at important moments, at times causing tension and jealousy, and at times being as dignified garments for the high priest, as something which was illustrious. So what are these clothing? So before we get there, what are clothing in general? So there's a famous saying, the clothing make the man. And it's not far off. We know we experience people differently based on what they're wearing. Someone walks into the room, we size them up, right? You size people up immediately.
Yes.
But part of sizing someone up is the way they're dressed. Right? If someone walks into the room wearing a suit and tie and is well dressed, there's a certain assumption about them. Assumption could be of wealth and status. Assumption, you assume that what they're saying, they know what they're talking about. You probably listen to them faster because they have a certain air about them. Or it could be the opposite. You suspect about them. They're a little too savvy. So we judge people based on how they're dressed. And so they project a certain image. And when we choose what to wear, we're choosing how we want to project ourselves. So I can choose to wear a certain wardrobe because I want to give off a certain one image. Or I can change my wardrobe up to give off a different image. And we can have a very broad wardrobe depending on the day. But essentially, when we choose our clothing, we're not just choosing, oh, I like this. I like these colors, or this looks good on me, but it's also, I want to project this image. Or, I don't want to project that image. So, sometimes it's a careful selection. You want to be dressed smart, not too smart, casual, not too casual. There's always how you want to give off your impression. You're going to an interview. There's a whole question. How should you dress? And there's like these detailed guides which can guide you through depending what the interview is and who it's with and who you are. It's all because our clothing tell a lot about us. So if you think about it, it's actually a dual thing at play with clothing. On the one hand, clothing are hiding ourselves, right? We're hiding behind our clothes. It's a barrier which we're putting up to protect ourselves from other people, to create distance between ourselves and others. On the other hand, it's a form of expression, that we're revealing something about ourselves. It's the way of me showing you who I am. I'm expressing that in my clothing. If you just saw everyone naked, you wouldn't know much about them until you spoke to them, got to know them well. But now that we have clothing, the choice of clothes tells you about that person. So it's actually a revealing about the person. So we have that dichotomy that it's concealing and revealing. In Hebrew, the word beged, which is clothing, also means boged, which means like, what's the English word? It's in my mind. You're a traitor or a betrayal. So clothing can betray you, right? Which means clothing can give off a false impression. They don't necessarily reflect distance. But I saw recently something interesting that also the letters in Beged, the Beis, Gimel, Dalet, are 3 letters in order. And which seems to show a sort of flowing, emotion of flowing. And especially come the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th letters. So starting from the 1, which is the object, the 2nd flow, which means revealing, expression. And so the word Beged, clothing in Hebrew, has this duality inside of it. That at once it can betray the true nature of something, but also express it. Recently, modern psychology has discovered one further layer to clothing, which we'll see is really an ancient idea in Torah, that not only does clothing change the way other people perceive me, so I'm expressing myself outside myself, but it even changes the way I perceive myself. So when I wear different clothes, I feel differently about myself. It affects my subconscious to actually behave differently in ways I can't even control because I'm wearing different clothes. And they've done these studies where they give people like a certain assignment or a test, quiz, and one group of people wearing regular clothes, the other group of people gave lab coats to. It was like a science-related thing. The people wearing lab coats for taking the test did better, had better results on the test than the people who were wearing regular clothes. So just wearing that coat gave them the confidence, I belong here. This is my identity. Naturally, they performed better on the tests, which is an incredible thing. So not only do we express ourselves to other people, the way we wear clothing, that changes our own identity. For that moment, at least, while you're wearing it, right? It changes the way you view yourself, which subconsciously changes how you react to certain things, how well you do on certain things, and how you behave. So what we wear is incredibly important because it's expressing ourselves, it's creating an expression of our soul. So, going back to the Kohen Gadol, his clothing and the priest's clothing, we find in Torah that they were very important that the priests wear these clothes. If they wouldn't wear them, the service was considered null, void, invalid. They weren't allowed to wear this clothing outside of the service. So they weren't allowed to walk out of the temple wearing their clothes. But inside the temple, they had to wear. So there's something unique about this clothing that it wasn't just a uniform. You go to work with this uniform. It's like just to create everyone looking the same and uniformity. Because regular people wear the uniform to work. They couldn't wear their clothing to work. There's this elaborate discussion in the Talmud if you're allowed to have benefit from the clothing. Meaning, am I allowed to use them for something other than wearing them? Or are they something considered holy which can't be used for anything outside of the actual service? Even as simple, when they would go to sleep, because the Kohanim would have shifts of a week. Each family had a week shift in the temple. And it's a complicated system of rosters, all the priestly families. But during that week, they would sleep in the temple in a special room for the Kohanim, their sleeping quarters. And the question is, were they allowed to fold up their clothes and use them as a pillow? Or is that considered, I'm deriving benefit, I'm employing these clothes for personal usage. So the clothing had a certain holiness to them, sanctity to them. And there's more to them that meets the eye. So let's read a few sources here explaining these clothing. But first, what was the clothing the Kohen Gadol wore? So 28:4, we have, these are the vestments, these are the clothes they had to make. A breastplate, that was the choshen. It was a plate which the high priest wore with 12 stones, gemstones, each one engraved with the name of the tribes of Israel. A robe, a fringed tunic, a headdress, and a sash. So these are just this is a selection of them. There are other that he wore that we find out later on about. So he wore a tzitz, he wore a headpiece that had God's name on it. The Talmud says that these articles of clothing were not accidental, but each one served a unique purpose. So if we skip one source here, we have Talmud in Zevachim. And this appears a few times in the Talmud. I've just quoted the beginning of the Talmud because it's a very long passage. But it says something very interesting. Rabbi Yanini Bar Sasson, he says, why was the passage that discusses offerings juxtaposed to the passage that discusses the priestly vestments? To tell you that just as offerings affect atonement, so too priestly vestments affect atonement. So, the clothing worn by the priests affected atonement for the Jewish people. Which means, not only did the general service in the temple impact the community, sacrifices, some of them were for atonement, and the idea of a temple was born out of atonement for the golden calf. So not only was the service done there impacting the Jewish community, but the clothing which the Kohanim, the representatives of the people, wore, by virtue of them wearing it, affected atonement for the Jews at large. Now, how does the mechanics of that work? So you could say there's some spiritual stuff going on here, and it's pressing some cosmic buttons that are affecting change. But why would just wearing clothing bring atonement to the nation? And the Talmud goes on to list each article of clothing, what it atoned for. And it finds scriptural sources to back that up. Wow. So how did these clothing affect atonement for the Jews? So I think this tells us a very, deep nature of clothes and what clothes do. The uniform which the Kohanim wore, we're told, was L'chava Luciferis, translated here for dignity and adornment. Kavod means honor, Tiferes means beauty, adornment. So, what does that mean? What does it mean, dignity and adornment? We have a bunch of commentaries, and one in particular which I think will address how they could have affected atonement based on what the purpose and the nature of these clothes were. So, the Or HaChaim, a fascinating commentary who often brings in mystical ideas into the commentary on Torah, he starts off with one explanation and then he goes into another one. I quoted the second one here. So he says we need to explore the meaning of the word lechavod, for honor, in this verse, after God already informed us of both the purpose and nature of these garments. He says, what does it mean for honor? Of course, you're describing the garments. I know these are beautiful garments. I know that they're dignified, they're made out of gold. So of course they're for honor. Of course they're for beauty. Why would the verse need to tell me these are there for honor and for beauty? And he quotes here from the introduction to Tikkunei Zohar, one of the mystical works, which writes, the 4 golden garments are an allusion to the 4 letters in the ineffable name, whereas the 4 white linen garments are an allusion to the 4 letters in God's name, Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud. We should remember that the ineffable name reflects God's attribute of Tiferes, of beauty, whereas God's name, Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, reflects Kavod, honor. God directed that 8 garments be made for the high priest in order for him to be able to obtain atonement for his people for the various imperfections that people are guilty of as a normal part of their lives. So what I think he's saying is this. This is my understanding of it. So it's not so clear, but this is what I think he's saying. These clothing were designed to reflect God. So, l'chavod u'l'sifaris, for honor and for dignity, means God who is honorable and God who is dignified. So these clothing were meant to reflect in some way the nature of God. Now, how they reflected is a study for itself. How each one of the clothing somehow embodied a certain image or attribute of God. But the Kohen wearing those clothing reflected that side of the human spirit. By wearing the clothing, he expressed that side of himself, the godliness, the divine within. And what does atonement mean? When you sin to someone, a friend, you mess up in a relationship, you do something wrong to them, and you're looking for atonement, what are you really looking for? Forgiveness. But what does forgiveness mean?
Absolution.
It means that we're not just, forget the past. We're getting beyond that in our relationship, right? So we're recreating the relationship or reaffirming the relationship despite what happened. So it's not enough to say, just pretend it didn't happen. You can pretend it didn't happen, but the impact on the relationship still happened, right? Forget the act, but its consequence is still there. It created distance. Forgiveness, atonement means that we're getting back together again. We're repairing the relationship. In fact, the etymology of atonement comes from at one, to come together, to come one, to reunite. And so when we speak about in religious terms, atonement, what we're really saying is we've created a certain distance between ourselves and God in sin. We've messed up. We've pushed God away from our lives. We've ruined the relationship to some degree. And atonement is we want to reaffirm our commitment to God. We want to mend, repair the broken relationship. And so, on a personal level, when we can rediscover the divine within ourselves, that's how we effect atonement. It's not through going through fasting and whatever form of suffering. That's not how atonement comes about. And maybe you need to do that to make yourself a better person. But it really is rediscovering in yourself that relationship you have with God. So when the high priest would wear these clothing, it would express the godly side of himself, which in turn, as a leader, he would help the rest of the Jews bring out that element of their personality too. And that atoned for their sins. That enabled them to get beyond whatever came between them and God and revive the relationship. And so, not only did he wear these clothes, the clothes sort of created that persona within him. And that goes back to what I said we've discovered in modern psychology, that clothing actually create a way of thinking for ourselves. This can extend beyond clothing as well. Environments really impact us to the extent that we don't even know that we're being impacted by the environment. So subtle things around us that we may not even notice are actually telling us how to think and changing the way we think. It's a very hard thing to define, but many studies have been done in behavioral economics where they change situations around details and people react differently. There's a book I read a while ago. It was called Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. He's a behavioral economist. And some of the examples there are incredible. One that I remember is they opened on campus a coffee shop, pop-up coffee shop. And they would charge a certain amount for coffee. I don't know exactly the details. But then they put the condiments in these really fancy little jars. And suddenly people were willing to pay much more for the coffee. Even if they weren't taking the condiments. They weren't taking sugar, they weren't taking. But the fact, the image changed, that everyone thought the coffee was worth more. Must be better coffee because it's served in nicer glasses. Or even other things in the store are served in nicer dishes. So we're picking up cues subconsciously from everything around us that's impacting how we decide decisions, impacting how we behave. And so the environment where the Kohen was doing his work was designed to enable that spiritual process to effect. So all the garments that the Kohen Gadol wore were to express and to help him develop that spiritual sensitivity during the service. So if we backtrack a little and say, now we get what God was giving Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They needed clothing because they discovered an inner shame, or they had created an inner shame through sin. And so they chose clothing, the fig leaves, which was their instinctual reaction, to cover themselves. But God wants them not only to have clothing to cover themselves, clothing that would also reveal themselves. Now the thing is, in order to reveal ourselves, a certain part of ourselves, we need to be concealed. If you're totally open, then nothing specific is being channeled through. No specific idea is coming into the open. Only when I'm concealing myself to a degree, I can choose what I'm showing, what I'm not showing. Then I'm revealing something specific. Like when you have a little crack in the window and you see the light, very distinct, line of light from the sun coming through. That you notice that light. If the window's open, you don't notice light. The whole room is just lit up. There's no point where, here the reflection, the light starts, here it ends. So when there's concealment, then you're able to reveal as well. But the question is, are you concealing, or are you concealing for the sake of revealing? And so when Adam and Eve, they covered up, they wanted to hide their shame. They felt internal negativity that they want to just cover. I'm embarrassed of who I am. I'm not comfortable with who I am, and therefore I'm hiding it with clothing. And God gave them clothing that's able to express the good in them. The clothing that God gave was that Adam and Eve, yes, we have in us now this struggle between good and bad. But we're able to express the good part of ourselves. We're able to wear something, whether practically or metaphysically, wear something that can express the good. And that's the clothing of skins, garment of skins that God gave them. There's a fascinating midrash. The word skin here is or, ayin vav resh. Or, if you put an aleph, the first letter instead of an ayin, is light. So Rabbi Meir says, this actually God gave him clothing of light. You sort of purposely misread the word. And what that means is God gave him clothing that's able to also shine. Clothing which are hiding that are really revealing. Revealing the good, revealing the divine within. And that's the clothing which were passed down, eventually became the clothes of the Kohen Gadol. Because the clothes that he was wearing was designed to allow that inner light to shine forth, to express itself. Now, none of us are wearing the high priest clothes, and our clothes aren't designed with any deep Kabbalistic measurements. But we have the same thing. We choose how we dress. And not only in the specific clothing we wear, but we choose how we hold ourselves. We choose the environment around us, where we hang out. In our homes, we design our homes. We design the environment that we're in. And those environments, those things around us can serve to numb ourselves, to hide ourselves, to escape from who we are. Or we can choose to design our lives to express the goodness, to dig deep within and find out who we really are, who we're proud of being, and live that out, express that. And that's a choice we constantly make. In a very practical way, clothing. But truth is, at home around us, there are subtle things that we can have in our home that create a different atmosphere. That we may not even know what's creating the atmosphere, but it's there. That's creating something. For example, the Rebbe created a campaign that people should have Jewish libraries in their home. He called it Bayis Malei Sfarim. A house should be full of good books, Jewish books. And he once said, it's not about learning them. Of course, you should learn them. If you're there, you can have access to them. But it creates a certain environment in the home. When you have a bookshelf of Jewish books there, for yourselves, for your children, you're creating something, an environment. This is the same is true of books in general. They say people grow up with more books at home, their literacy is higher. Just because you grow up in that, it's a norm. We read books, or there are books on our shelves. It's a normal thing to have books around. In Jewish books, same thing. You're creating a Jewish environment in the home. Now, that's a very subtle thing. You walk into your house, you don't even notice the bookshelf. You don't notice what books are there. But overall, you're creating a certain environment. Certain things feel more comfortable, less comfortable based on those surroundings. Wearing different clothing at different times. So in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Law, it says there are certain times we should wear unique clothing to put ourselves in a different zone. On Shabbat, we should have set Shabbat wardrobe, clothing that are unique for Shabbat, to put us in a separate festive mood. Not just fancy dress, doesn't need to be fancy, less fancy. So these are designated for a special day of the week. And I wear them, I now feel differently. I know it's Shabbos. I know I'm feeling something different because these are the clothes I wear on Shabbos. For prayer, dress respectfully means put on clothing that you feel respectful. You're about to go and speak to God. And so you should dress respectfully. I know people that only pray in a button-down shirt. I mean, in camp, they used to keep a shirt in the shul and say, run around in sports, then come back on the shul, put on the shirt to pray. And the idea was, it's not a game, it's that when I wear a button-down shirt, I feel more formal. I was saying about formalities. Small formalities create different image in your head of what's going on. And when you wear, you create a certain environment for yourself. Okay, this is something formal, something now, I'm in a different state of mind than I am on the street. It's the idea of yarmulke. That we wear something that's creating a certain zone for ourselves. So, very practically, the way we dress, the way we dress ourselves, dress our homes, dress up our environments, we make choices in how we want to express ourselves. We make choices in not only how we want to express ourselves to others, but who we want to make ourselves into. What elements of ourselves do we want to bring out? And we don't even realize how powerful those choices are. They actually change who we are. They change how we behave and how we act and react. And so we should spend time thinking about, what is it that's important to me? Which part of myself do I want to identify with? Where's the goodness in me that I can reveal through these concealing clothing? There's a the Talmud. Here's interesting. In Shabbat 7:7, B, the second to last source here. He goes through 4 articles of clothing and their name expressing what that clothing does to a person. I didn't translate all of it, but I'll translate it outside here. Levusha, clothing, lo busha, means you shouldn't have shame. Glima is a more outer clothing, like a coat or something bigger. Shenase bo kegoylam, it makes you into this just shapeless thing. Gulta, something a more dressy clothing. Gali ve'isiv, so you take it off and then sit down. And finally, sudra, a head covering. Sod Hashem lireav, comes from the word, the secrets of God are those who fear Him. So every article of clothing is going to reflect something and also impact that same thing. And the Talmud recognizes that the names, these are Aramaic names of clothing, or not of specific article of clothing, but of designations of clothing, are really terms that express what these clothing do. So we have the same thing in 2 sources up, in Shabbat 113a. Rabbi Yochanan will refer to his clothing as my honor. So the clothing were a badge of honor, his clothing. In particular, wearing nice clothing. He felt the Talmud Chacham, he represented Torah scholars, and he wore nice clothing, so that's going to express my dignity. So we realize that dressing a certain way is going to put him in a certain image. Talmud says that a scholar, Torah scholar, that walks out on the street with a stain on his shirt is liable for death from heaven, meaning it's a very strong offense. And the reason is you're bringing disrespect to Torah scholars. If a scholar can walk around like that, it means that they don't hold themselves at esteem. So the way I'm presenting myself to others tells you about me and what I represent. So our clothing is a window. As much as it covers over myself, I can choose to dress how I want. Tomorrow I can dress like a punk. The next I can dress in a suit and tie, and I can put on these images, and no one will know if it's real or not. Right? I can present myself in a certain way. You go and Purim, and everyone's dressed up, and suddenly they look different. And some people can pass on a regular day like that. You would never know, because clothing conceal. You can make up whatever image you want. But essentially, they're also revealing. Because even if you're wearing clothing that doesn't match who you are, it's matching who you want to be. So it's revealing something about you. And if you want to wear these clothes, means could be you want to be something you're not, but you want to be that. That tells me about you. But especially if they actually are reflective of who you are, then they're opening up a window to your soul. If we take this, one step removed, there's a fascinating idea in Chassidus that comes from the Tanya, that the soul itself has clothing. Just like the body has clothing that can hide it and express it, the soul has clothing that, on one hand, hide it, but also express it. What's the clothing of the soul? Our body. So on one level, our body is the clothing of the soul. But there's a soul clothing as well. So a metaphysical clothing is the metaphysical soul. And in Tanya he says, that's our thought, speech, and action. Our conscious expression of the soul is the clothing of the soul. We have inside an identity, who we are. But then there's how we experience that identity. So our thoughts are not us, but it's how we know ourselves. It's our conscious selves. There's really a subconscious. There's a me. And our thought is just an expression of the me. Right? Even further removed is talk, speech. It's how I express my soul to other people. So thought is how I know of the soul, how it's reflected in my own realization of it, and speech is how it's reflected in other people's realization of the soul. And then how I behave, how I act, is in a sense even further removed, because it's not directly telling me who you are. You can't articulate the same things in action and behavior as you can in speech and thought. And so the soul is this unidentifiable thing inside of us. And it has clothes that dress it up, that we experience it through. Just like I experience you through your clothing. That's the image I have of you. And so this is the image we have of the soul, how it's dressed up with these clothes. Our thought, speech, and action can conceal the soul, so we can be incongruous with who we are. They can cover up our true identity. Definitely action and speech, but even thoughts. Right? We can be so out of touch with ourselves that our conscious self is not a reflection of who we really are. What we're thinking about the whole day is actually hiding. We're hiding from ourselves. We're distracting ourselves from ourselves. We're numbing ourselves from who we are. Because we're uncomfortable maybe who we are, or we don't know who we are. And so these garments, these clothes of the soul, can block, can be a real divide, distance between who we are, our souls, and how we know ourselves, how others know us. But they can also be incredibly revealing. They can be tools that the soul expresses itself with. When our thoughts are in sync with who we really are, when our speech is able to express, we articulate who we are. We're honest. We're authentic. We're vulnerable. We speak what's on our mind, what's in our hearts. Our speech is a conduit of revelation of the soul, as opposed to hiding from ourselves, blocking ourselves off. And our action the same way. We're living a life that's in sync with what we believe, in sync with our values, in sync with our core, who we are. Often, our behavior is not. Even if our thought and speech are, which they're also often not, but even if they are, at the end of the day, I know this is wrong, or I think, but I live this way, this is my life. This is my comfort, this is what I grew up with, this is where I find fulfillment and enjoyment, and so it's irrelevant whether it's actually a reflection of who I want to be and who I think I should be. But then, our behavior is becoming a piece of clothing that's covering up our soul. It's not letting ourselves be expressed, which is the negative side to clothing. It's the unideal side to clothing. Or we can have the clothing of Adam that God gave him. We can have the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, which express ourselves, which are tools that we use to express ourselves, which we wouldn't be able to do without that tool. Without clothing, we wouldn't know how to express ourselves. We wouldn't have a way of communicating that. And so clothing, which could be a divisive tool that can hide us, actually ends up being employed in the positive, that it gives me a way to express myself. And so we can't change who we are. Our soul is our soul, and we're all going to have different personalities. But we can change our thought, speech, and action. Just like I can take off a pair of clothing, put another pair of clothing on, with very little effort. I can instantly change my thought patterns. I can instantly change the way I speak and what I say. And I can instantly change my behavior. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's possible right now to do something different. I can move my arm left, move my arm to the right. I can decide to do that in 1 second. Because it's only a clothing. But the flip side of that is, if I want to become a better person, I want to grow, I want to improve. To really improve who I am deep down is a lifelong task. Doesn't mean we shouldn't work on it, but it's something which is, we're in for the long haul. But my thoughts, my speech, my action, I can change it today. The clothing. I can today wear different clothing than I wore yesterday. But they're also very powerful clothing, that when I speak differently, I'm actually expressing myself differently. I'm becoming a different person. When I behave differently, it's not only in my behavior, the behavior is impacting me. I actually become different. I know myself differently now. I self-identify differently because I've changed my behavioral patterns. They say someone came to Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, was a rabbi in Germany. He was, to a degree, the founder or the father of modern Orthodoxy. And a fascinating man. He fought in his time the beginnings of the Reform movement, and he created within Orthodoxy a movement which would appeal to people who were more open or have already gone into what they call it the Haskalah, the Enlightenment movement. And someone came to him and said, he asked the guy, why aren't you religious? Why don't you do these mitzvahs? Why aren't you practicing? So the guy said, I don't do these because I don't believe. So he told him, the truth is that it's the opposite. You don't believe because you don't practice. They're telling you that the behaviors, the practice you do actually trains your mind a certain way that you identify differently. And so when you behave a certain way, when you talk a certain way, you're expressing a different side of yourself, which is where you begin to identify with that side of yourself. And it changes how you know yourself. It changes who you are as a person. So, I don't know how late it was. So, just finish off, I'll summarize that clothing, ideally Adam and Eve were fully expressed. They wore themselves in their sleeves, without sleeves. They were in the open. Only once there became a negative side to them, became sin, they started to feel shame. They wanted to cover themselves up. Clothing was invented to hide themselves. But God wasn't satisfied with their clothing. He gave them different clothing. He gave them a clothing that's able to reveal a part of themselves, to express themselves. And that's what the goal in the high priest clothing was, to express the divine within the Kohen Gadol, which in turn would express in the Jewish nation and Shiva Toman. And that's what we have with our clothing and with our environments that we create around us. That we should be searching to express who we really are, the good within us, the soul that we have. And our clothing should be windows into who we are. Our environments should be conducive to allow us to be who we are. And our metaphysical clothing, our thought, speech, and action, they also can be distractions from ourselves, and often it's tempting to go that way. We want to distract ourselves from our issues, from our struggles, and therefore we deflect it by speaking a different way and acting a different way and ignoring who I really want to be, ignoring who I am, because I'm letting my thoughts, speech, and action, my clothing, hide myself from myself even. But they can also be incredible tools to express ourselves, to develop ourselves. And when we employ them, when we act a certain way, when we think and speak a certain way, we actually change the way we identify ourselves, change who we are. And we can, almost from the outside in, become better people. By changing behavioral patterns, we change our brain structure, and we change our soul structure. So we actually, from the outside in, become better people. Because we identify differently, and that expresses a different side of ourselves. So that is, in a nutshell, the Kabbalah of clothing. And what we can learn, what we can utilize clothing for, and how powerful they can be in our life. Questions? Comments?
It makes shop therapy a real thing.
Sorry?